spend hours and hours in the dark room with black and white film and stuff like that. Now, for the last 10 years I've been professional. I studied 2 years at the Christchurch Polytech of Art and Design. And hello.
I have trouble hearing back here.
Yeah, that's. I'm sorry. You're going to have to come forward. That's why I need.
Can you speak a little louder?
I cannot, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah. So, 2 years study at the School of Art and Design in Christchurch. Then, for the last 8 years, for 4 years, I've been shooting weddings, portraits, a little bit of fashion, some commercial stuff. I worked for 2 years for an online photo stock library, and then for the last 4 years I've been working for Princess as a photographer, on the front lines as it were, shooting the gangways, the formal nights, the restaurant photos and all the stuff which you guys have come to know and love. And for the last 3 months I've been one of the ship's platinum artists. It's only on 3 ships at the moment, where we've taken the black and white out of the formal night backgrounds and the casual night backgrounds, and it's now a dedicated studio where we treat it as such. It's a half-hour session. We pay real on-land prices and what have you. So that's a little bit about me. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the basics of photography, starting from the most basic things. Hi there, have you guys signed up?
No, we're just here.
Okay, no worries. The basics of photography, starting from exposures and then going through to composition. Some of it might be very simple for those that have been doing photography for years. You might get a little bit here and there which may or may not be useful. But for those that are in that beginning to average sort of area, then you might gain a lot more. Fully manually. These days we have these things which pretty much do the job for us. What I'm going to do is I'm trying to encourage you to step back 150 years and see if you can start taking real photos again using your heads, the lighting around you, and just a couple of simple formulas. There are 3 parts to getting the perfect photo, and you can get it every time if you get the exposure, the focus and the composition correct. Those are the 3 things that you need to get the perfect photo. These days the camera will get the exposure correct 90% of the time. There will be difficult lighting conditions that will require you to do a little bit of thinking to override the camera if possible. For those of us that are shooting with the big SLRs, then we do have the ability to go fully manually at the flick of a switch, and it's a lot easier than some of the compact cameras which you have to fiddle around with little switches and what have you. Some of the compact cameras can allow you to shoot manually. If you don't have that capability, then what I suggest is that just use the normal program mode, and you'll be able to work more on your composition than your exposures. Okay, the exposures, there's 3 parts to the exposure, and you've got to treat it like an accounting ledger. Basically, there is a rule that someone invented around about 100 years ago called the Sunny F16 rule. Basically, if you go out at lunchtime on a bright sunny day and you have your camera setting to 1/100th of a second, 100 ISO and F16, that will be the perfect exposure for you every single time. There are a couple of variables mixed in amongst that now. Digital cameras have changed the equation a little bit, and that most cameras start with 200 ISO. The fact that they started to put into the exposures and the shutter speeds into lots of thirds has confused people with regards to exposures now. If we start with that 100, 100 and F16, we'll start with the ISO. That's the easiest thing to talk about. In the old days, and when I say in the old days, I'm talking 10 years ago, you used to put film into your camera and you used to have to choose what speed film that you had. For most of us as an amateur, we would have used 200 or 400 speed ISO film, which meant that on a bright sunny day, the 200 speed film would be quite fine grain, and when you have them printed up to an 8x10, it'll look quite nice. If it was a dull, cloudy day, then you might go up to 400 ISO, and that will allow you to get nice, brightly exposed pictures. Professionals in the studio would have gone all the way down to 64 ISO, so they get a very, very sharp grain. Sports photographers, they would have gone all the way up to 800, 1600 ISO, so they're able to take photos in nighttime stadiums where things are moving around and it's very dark. This is one of the few things that you should remain more or less constant when you're shooting with your digital cameras these days. I always encourage people to stay around about 100 or 200 ISO whenever possible. This room here, our eyes have adjusted to this darkness in the room over the last 20 minutes. So we can see quite nicely, but the camera won't be able to see very nicely at all. So shooting in here, for those of us with the high-end pro cameras, we could probably get away with a 1600 speed ISO. With the small compact cameras, of brands that doesn't include Canon and Nikon, you probably get away with maybe a 400 speed ISO before it starts to get quite noisy. Now noise is the modern day version of grain. You'll know that in the... We'll just wait for that. Or not. Okay, so noise is the modern day version of grain. You all know that when you look at something under a magnifying glass in the newspaper, you see lots of large dots, which is splotched everywhere, and that's called grain. The digital version of it means that the camera has to guess what the colours are, and when it can't guess, it'll make it up. So grain is now noise, which is sometimes very ugly, but we do have software that can correct that. That's a little bit of an aside, and I go on a lot of asides, so just bear with me when I go off on a tangent here or there. Okay, so your film speed, you want to keep it as constant as possible and as low as possible. Outside on that bright sunny day, you can go for your 100 or your 200 ISO and you won't have any problems with it at all. When you go into the churches, the castles, and it gets very dark, you might go up to an 800 ISO. If you want to, you can go up to 1600 ISO if you know you're going to be printing quite small. If it's going to be a 4x6 inch print, then you'll have no problems with regards to the final image quality. But if you're going to be blowing it up this size here, then you will need to worry very much about what ISO you're going to be using. Okay, obviously they're just trying to test me there. If it's for commercial purposes, or if you know you're going to be blowing it up big, as I said, go down to the 100, 200 speeds. For those of you that have the compact cameras, take it off automatic now and put it on program mode whenever possible, because in automatic mode your camera is actually deciding the ISO for you, and in some cases it might not be a very attractive ISO to use. So if you put it in program mode, you can decide your ISO and keep it as low as you possibly can. Okay, the next part of the next two parts of the equation are a little bit more critical, and that's the shutter speed and the f-stop. The f-stop is a hard thing to explain. All I can do is say, look in the mirror and look at your eyes. The iris is pretty much what an f-stop is or does. When it's bright, the iris will be very closed, small, so that it lets in less light. When it's dark, your iris will be quite wide open and it's letting in a greater amount of light. That's what an f-stop does. Now, one of the side effects to an f-stop, the smaller the iris is, or the f-stop, the greater the depth of field. So if I'm wanting to photograph this lady here, and I wanted to get those people in the background, then I will use a very small f-stop of around about f22 to make sure that I have a larger depth of field. If I'm a sports photographer and I want just the athlete in focus and I want the entire background out of focus, I'll use an f2.8 or a 1.4 or something like that. So that focusing on this lady here at f2.8, the entire background will be out of focus. The shutter speed, I'll answer questions later on. The shutter speed basically is how long the shutter is left open for how much light is left in. Now there is lots of things we can use the shutter speeds for. If you're using a very high shutter speed like 4000, then you'll pretty much stop all of the action. Like you would have seen classic photos of a drop of water hitting a pond and you'll see it all splash out, and someone will take the photograph and everything will be frozen. You'll see little droplets of water everywhere and it'll look quite nice. On the other hand, if you're photographing motor racing and you want to show the car as being relatively sharp and the background as being a blur, then you'll use a very slow shutter speed of around about a 30th of a second, and you'll actually track the car or pan. As the car's coming past you, you'll actually take the photograph here, you'll continue carrying on with the camera,